Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Today, I'm excited to bring you an inspiring conversation with Polina Marinova Pompliano, best-selling author of Hidden Genius, The Secret Ways of Thinking That Power the World's Most Successful People. In this episode, Polina takes us behind the curtain of extraordinary success, sharing insights from her journey as well as fascinating people she's profiled. We'll uncover lessons in mental toughness from a Holocaust survivor, explore resilience strategies embraced by icons like Beyonce and Kobe Bryant, and dive into leadership wisdom from Nick Saban, including how he built a culture of sustained excellence while coaching at Alabama. Pauline also explores the power of belonging in community, highlighting lessons from Taylor Swift on creating meaningful connections. So this episode is packed with practical takeaways. So let's dive in and help you unlock your own hidden genius. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. You have a great profile on Edith Eger, and I'm not sure how many people know her, so give us her backstory if you could. And I love some of the quotes that you give in regards to that and really differentiating between victimhood versus, playing that victim role.
So Edith Eger is a Holocaust survivor. Her book, The Choice, is one of my favorite books on the planet. Incredibly well written, but also the mental resilience she has is truly admirable. She says there's a difference between being a victim between victimization and victimhood. She says, like, at some point in our lives we'll be on the receiving end of something. There will be the partner who yells at you, the boss who's treats you horribly, the neighborhood bully. You'll be on that receiving end of this victimization. But you don't have to think of yourself as a victim. You don't have to put that identity on yourself unless you want to. Victimhood is just constantly seeing yourself as somebody who she calls it as like living in the confines of this victim prison in your mind. You are the one who controls that. So it's obviously her experience is an extreme case of somebody who went through something truly horrendous, and she's still able to have that resilient mindset that I talk about in that chapter. It's very hard to cultivate, but the people who have mastered it, it's a complete game changer for them in terms of how they lead their lives.
Well, it's so impressive to think that, she went through all this and suffering is universal. She acknowledges that, right? But victimhood is optional. We're going to be victimized in some way throughout the course of our lives. At some point, you're going to suffer from some form of affliction or abuse, you mentioned, caused by
Yep.
circumstances that you have no control over. This is victimization. It comes from the outside. Victimhood
Yes.
comes from the inside, and no one can make you a victim but you. And that's really in your mind and how your mindset is. So it's such a powerful story and a reminder for people that if you don't give in to victimhood, you can develop the kind of mental resilience that will carry you through likely the most difficult situations.
Exactly, yeah. And I think in that chapter, it's one of my favorite chapters because there are so many tiny specific techniques that you can do to improve or to strengthen your resilience muscle.
You also mentioned something that I think was really profound and effective, that a lot of successful people, they adopt a third person personality. David Goggins calls himself Goggins, Sasha Fierce for Beyonce, the Black Mamba for Kobe Bryant. It's all giving them that separation to say, I need to go into that role. And that role is of a person that has greater mental resilience and exudes those qualities that I want to hopefully incorporate into who I am today. So eventually that distinction between who they are and who I am goes away at some point, right?
It all kind of stems from this. There's a literary device called Iliism, which is referring to yourself in the third person. When people do it, people don't like it. People don't like it when I would say, Paulina's the greatest. Like, people wouldn't like that. It's just like, say I. It's often a form of that is often used with post-traumatic stress therapy, where it helps take the patient and give them a little bit of distance between them and what's happening to them. So it's what Edith said. It's like the circumstances versus the inside. And by referring to yourself in the third person, you can kind of see the story from a slight distance, and it gives you perspective. The reason the people you mentioned, they use something called an alter ego, which is they create a character that they can become in moments when they have to perform. In moments of high stress, high pressure, I'm not myself, I'm this other being. The reason that's powerful is because, again, it creates distance between how you feel you are and the person you want to become. And it's often in moments of stress or pressure. So, for example, Kobe Bryant, at that point in his career, he was not very popular. He was getting booed everywhere he went, and people were saying, "Boo, Kobe." So, he was like, okay, when I step on that court, I am no longer Kobe Bryant. I am now the Black Mamba. And it's like this snake and this, that he would visualize it. So he would go on, he would hear Boo Kobe, but mentally he had made that distinction. So he was able to become this other thing. He was like, I'm now performing as this other thing. Beyonce was really introverted and shy, but she knew she couldn't be like that if she was going to be a global powerhouse on stage. She would have to dance a certain way she wasn't comfortable. She would have to, perform and dress and all these things that she would never do in her normal life. So instead of being Beyonce, she called herself Sasha Fierce. That's my stage name, performance, identity, and it would give her confidence. I do the same thing. I used to be very uncomfortable going on stage and speaking, but then I kind of thought of myself as playing a role. I was like, I am now going to play the role of journalist. It is my job to ask these hard questions, all this stuff. That took the edge off, and the nerves went away because I knew I was playing a character. And David Goggins, he's, this extreme athlete. He used to be severely bullied as a kid. So he says, David Goggins was a weak kid. And David Goggins' whole thing is built, not born. So he's like, I built Goggins. Like, this is my identity. And I actually don't like the term alter ego. I more like aspirational self. It's the person you aspire to be. And the more that you can act like your aspirational self, the more that delta between who you are and who you want to become starts to narrow, the more that you do it. So as Beyonce started performing more and more, her confidence went up naturally. And then she kind of became this aspirational self of Sasha Fierce. So in a later interview in her career, they said, so what happened to Sasha Fierce? And she's like, oh, I killed her long ago. Like, I am now that person. So you don't end up needing the psychological crutch over the long period of time when you've actually become this person. But sometimes that road to becoming that mentally resilient, like tough, thick-skinned person can be a long one. So it's helpful to have something like that.
Another area that they struggle with, and they believe once again that either you're born with it or you're not, is storytelling. They think if I'm not a good storyteller, there's no reason to work on it. No, it's a skill that needs to be built over time. And you had a lesson that I'd love for you to share with our listeners about your experience that you were assigned someone that you thought was just inherently boring. And your instructor, your professor said, you know what, there are no boring people. You just didn't ask the right questions.
Yes. This is not just the great framework for profiles, but also life. I think so. I was in college. It was like my first year in journalism, and one of the assignments was do a profile of someone in the class. And I chose this guy. I thought he was very boring because I would ask questions and he would kind of like not really go deep with me. You want people to like go there and tell me all your struggles and insecurities. And he was just like, nope, pretty normal childhood. Yep, everything was good. And he was just like, give me something. So I went to my professor and I was like, yeah, I'm not. I'm just going to find somebody new and then I'll write the best profile. He was like, no, that's not how this works. And so he explained to me that there are no inherently boring people, and it's not up to your subject or the person you're talking to entertain you. It's up to you to like ask a bunch of questions and hit on something that like, oh, well, that's really fascinating. Like, let's explore that more. But I hadn't done the exploratory phase of asking questions. I thought it was up to him to give me these like polished, amazing quotes that I could write my profile with. So I've kind of kept that in the back of my mind always. And every time I encounter someone really challenging or someone not as forthcoming with their life story, I actually know that there's probably a lot more going on under the surface. They're just not, super extroverted and want to entertain me with their life story. Nobody is inherently boring. You just haven't asked the right questions yet. Is just, I think, a really great framework for life.
And becoming a better storyteller involves being curious, listening to those individuals. And then for your stories, everyone has great stories, and other people that are even normal, ordinary people.
In the beginning of that chapter, I include a quote from Ira Glass from This American Life. And he says, great stories happen to those who can tell them, or something along those lines. But the the idea is that, how there's like some really good storytellers in your life. It's not that all these out of the ordinary things keep happening to them. It's that they know how to frame a story and tell it well with peaks, valleys, climaxes, conflict, all this stuff. And because they're such a good storyteller, everybody's like, oh, I can't wait to hear what happens next. Whereas someone else may have the exact same experience, but tell the story in a completely boring and flat way.
What would you say is the most underrated quality of a great leader that you've noticed from all the profiles that you've done?
I think the most underrated quality of a great leader is someone who is willing to be invisible. And I mentioned this in the book, which is Mark Bertolini, who was the former CEO of Aetna, then he was a former co-CEO of Bridgewater. He used to be very ruthless. He was a very ruthless leader to the point where he would walk down the hallway, he would hear people like hum the Darth Vader tune that, oh, he's coming. He was not liked at all. He says that actually it's counterintuitive, but great leaders should get the hell out of the way. That should be their job. It's not to, because when you think about, like, let's say a Fortune 500 CEO, the ultimate leader in business, they often try to do things that they can then show their board of directors like, hey, look at all the changes I made, look at all the things that I did. This company cannot operate without me. But actually, the best leaders can make their whole goal should be to become invisible over the long term so that the company can run itself without them. And they don't stand in the way. They've made it so efficient and so optimized that they can get out and the company would operate as business as usual. Bertolini was really inspired by like Eastern philosophy and meditation and yoga and things like that. And so he created this philosophy that he adapted from the Tao Te Ching. And it's basically there's 4 levels of leadership. At the first level is your employees hate you. The next one is they fear you. The third level is they praise you. And the fourth level is, you're invisible and they pat themselves on the back because they say, good job, we did it. We did it. Not you did it, but we did it. And they take the credit for something that you've cultivated. That's the highest level of like leadership.
That's a great story. There's another piece of that leadership that I think is what you mentioned in the book, in the chapter, that Nick Saban does really well, because a lot of leaders, they care about their position, but they don't care enough about the people. And Nick Saban, probably the most successful college coach in history, he cared about football, but he cared about his people even more. And he invested a ton of time and money to understand his players as people, not just as players. And that really made a difference. I mean, and the results showed for the success of his team and his university. But he wanted to make sure that he was giving back to players and looking at them as individuals, which so many leaders, would be great to do, that servant mindset that you were mentioning, but also just, focusing on the individuals. Do you know their names? Do you know what's going on in their lives? Are you really, kind of in touch with them? Or is it just kind of, just someone that you see and you just expect something from?
Yes. Okay. So I really truly think that every single, whether the best leaders, the best writers, the best investors, you have to deal with individual people, and you have to be good at evaluating individual people in order to make a good early investment, in order to write a great profile, in order to motivate your players. So the beauty in Nick Saban is that he can do both. He can see the organization as a whole, the team as a whole, but also the individual player, and he knows exactly how to motivate them. I remember reading in a profile in Fortune on Nick Saban about how he would know so well each player that he knew how to motivate them differently. So, for example, if I know that you are normally motivated by tough love and I just give it to you straight and I yell at you and I yell in your face, whatever, but then I also know that you just had, somebody passed away in your family last week. I'm not going to do that because you might break. So it's like super nuanced psychological techniques that he's using as a football coach. But we should all be doing that. If you've heard the stories of there's two siblings, brother and sister. Their dad is the same. He yells, he threatens, he does all this stuff. It really motivates one of them, and the other one, like, that's the cause of their demise. So it's like, because you don't know, the same technique doesn't work for everybody. You have to know how to properly motivate each person. And he talks about in that profile, for some people, it's like the tough love. The other people, you just gotta be very specific in your critique, and here's exactly where you went wrong. They respond well to that. And I think it's the same in a company or a family, any sort of organization. It's like, how can you use the individual psychology to motivate someone to get the result that ultimately is best for them and for you?
Absolutely. And another core leadership quality is for great leaders is a build and engage community within that organization. And there's so much evidence to support that it's lonely at the top. We're in the middle of a loneliness epidemic right now. This has always been evidenced by leaders, especially senior leaders, but it's now more pronounced than ever. There was a recent article on HBR that kind of showcases this as well. And you mentioned a unique distinction. A difference between an audience and a community is the way in which the chairs are facing, and the best antidote to loneliness is building a community.
Yes. So if you think about a Twitter account, you are writing something and you're sending it out to your audience. People, yes, they can engage with your tweets, but mostly it's a one-way communication. You're saying something, people are reacting to it. That's your audience. Unless you start engaging with every single one, you start messaging them, then it becomes a community. So I think thinking about which way the chairs are facing, Taylor Swift, she's here, the audience is here. One to many communication, but a community is usually in a circle where people have communication through, with each other. That's kind of how I think about my newsletter is, yes, I am writing something every Sunday, but then when people write in, we're engaged in a conversation. Sometimes I connect them with other people. So it's like very much a community or a membership or a club is the way I think about it, versus it's just me preaching and talking and nobody has access. So yeah, so I think the best organizations and the most loyal are usually communities.
And I think a lot of leaders can glean insight from your story of how you build a community from scratch, because you said it really starts with three key things to build lifelong loyalty: overserve your community members, build goodwill, and create moments of serendipity. I love that.
Yeah, I did this in 2019, I believe it was, or 2018. I was like, okay, who are all the people who are reading this newsletter? And I wanted to do something where on the same day, at this, well, not the same time because people are all over the world, but on the same day, all the profile readers all over the world would get together in the city closest to them. So it was basically like a global meetup full of individual meetups. People met up in Chicago, in India, in Kenya. There were people all over the world. And doing that, it took me a lot of time and a lot of coordination and a lot where it wasn't scalable. I didn't do this to get more subscribers. I didn't do this to get paid. I did this just because I knew that this is what builds community. You overserve your readers, you like go above and beyond to do this. You create moments of serendipity by, getting people to meet each other. And one person, I think it was in Kenya, he said, we met as strangers and we left as friends, which is like the best thing. The only thing they had in common was that they were both readers of this newsletter, but that actually shows that they're very curious people. They want to learn things like that. And yeah, it's just like you have to do things that don't always scale, but in the long run were very sticky and build a lot of loyalty. That's why Taylor Swift, even though she's a global superstar, she still like hand selects people to come to her listening parties at her house. She bakes them cookies. She shows up and surprises people at their weddings, like things that for her make zero sense, but she does them because she knows that that's what builds loyalty.
And that is really what, has built her fan base of Swifties. Lady Gaga's done it very effectively as well in identifying those communities and over serving them, giving them value. And like you said, it won't scale, but it creates these super fans that are responsible then for spreading the message to other ones. It has that momentum, that snowball effect that really will just launch careers if you do it the right way. And if they know that, it's really about them, right? Not about you. And you can see the difference between certain entertainers who really spend the time to get to know their community and build that solid base of fans, of super fans actually, versus those that think it's all about them and they don't need to really overserve their community. Leaders need solitude. They need that time for reflection during their day so they're not in execute mode always, but they don't want to be lonely. Explain to us the difference between solitude and loneliness, because I think society really kind of mixes them up. They think of them as just synonyms and can be used interchangeably.
Yes, and they're not synonyms at all. So, solitude and loneliness, the difference between them is perception, how you perceive what you are doing. So, the difference between solitude and loneliness is not the quantity of relationships that you have, but the perception to which you think they are close. So, if you feel like you have two very close best friends, when you're by yourself, you don't feel lonely because you know that you have some strong relationships there. You feel lonely when that perception is off. When you feel like, oh yeah, I have a lot of friends, but none of them know me. That's how you get lonely in a crowded room situation. You feel like they are not as deep as they should be. That perception leads to loneliness. So one of the biggest antidotes to loneliness actually is working on something that's bigger than you, something that's not just for yourself or just for someone else. It's something that's like bigger. Whether you're working with a charity or you're organizing a food drive or a toy drive or something that will touch many people, and you are working with other people on that project, it's like working together towards a common goal is like the ultimate antidote to loneliness. And ideally, leaders should cultivate that kind of thing within their organizations where it's not just about work, but it's also like, how is our work serving a bigger mission and serving a bigger goal?
And really, many people don't realize this because they look for other external validations of fame, of fortune, thinking it's going to make them happy. But the quality of your relationships determines the quality of your life. And like you said, you don't have to have a whole lot of those, but you do have to have a certain number so you don't feel lonely. So you have that peace of mind, and really you have a life that you'll look back on and say it was a great life lived because of the relationships that I fostered and developed with the people in my life. What is one piece of advice or wisdom from someone you've profiled that you tend to revisit somewhat regularly?
I end the book with this idea that at a certain point, you need to go bet on yourself. You need to take a risk and you need to be like, I'm betting on myself. This may not work. It may fail miserably, but I'm gonna go for it. And one of the people that I had interviewed was Francis Ngannou, who is a former heavyweight MMA champion. He came from extreme poverty. He got to where he is to a crazy winding path. But when I interviewed, he told me I interviewed him. He told me something that I've never really forgotten. He said that very talented, intelligent people, they stand in their own way often because they're scared to start over. They're just scared to take a risk that may make them start over. They're okay with having like enough or being average because they don't want to lose everything. Because the losing part is what really matters. He's like, I came from nothing. I'm not afraid. I can lose. You can take everything from me tomorrow, but I know that I have the skills to build it back. So he told me he told me like a quote that I had never really heard. He said, "You know the saying, sometimes to jump farther, you need to step back." And it's like, whoa, of course. The problem is most people aren't willing to take that step back. I think the biggest misconception people have about taking risks and failing is that they think, okay, well, I'm going to take this risk. And if it doesn't go well, I'm going to be at zero. But the truth is, you're not going to be at zero. You're actually going to be a little bit up here because you have all that experience that you just gained from failing that your competitors don't have. So if you want everything to go perfectly in your life, that's actually a disadvantage in the long run because you've never really learned anything. Everything's always just kind of gone right for you. There's no real, grit and resilience and thinking that it requires to get out of that situation. So the most successful people do two things largely. Three things. They take risks, they bet on themselves, and they know that if they fail miserably, they can always reinvent. And the most successful people have reinvented themselves probably at least 2 or 3 times.
How about, is there someone that you haven't profiled yet, but you would love to?
I've said this before, but I would love to profile or interview Elon Musk, but go the entire interview without talking about business and only talk about his personal life. I think that would be a fascinating interview.
I agree with you. There's many people I'd love to interview as well. And it's just, like you said, it's like we talked about initially, it's putting in the work up front, making sure that you've done your homework with, there being that risk, right? There's no certainty that you will get that interview. But if you enter into that with, genuine curiosity like you do, and really an interest in them regardless, I think you're coming from the right perspective and you have the best chance of success based on off of that work that you've done so far, and trying to secure those interviews or talk to those individuals. And some of the best interviews I've had are from people that no one even knows, right? They have some
Exactly.
amazing insights and stories. Sometimes I see the more famous ones, you just get the boilerplate, the same things they say over and over. And it's up to you as an interviewer to really pull out nuances or new ideas that they haven't talked about on, the umpteen different podcasts and interviews they've had in the last, month or two.
Exactly. That's why I interviewed JJ Watt, who people know, in the NFL. He's done a million interviews about football. But I was like, I'm going to go this entire interview without talking about football. So I got interesting things about his family life, his investments, things that people may not know, his philanthropy. So it's like they have lives beyond just what they do for work. So it's like you said, trying to pull out the unexpected. Try to start from an unexpected place. Interviewing Elon Musk about everything but business, unexpected, but you'll probably learn a lot more about the human than you have before.
If you could share only one piece of wisdom or advice from all your profiles, is there one that you would share? Or is there a couple that you would share?
Yes, one would be never tie your identity to something that is not your name. So don't tie your identity to something that you could lose, a job title, a relationship status, a material possession. All those things can be taken from you, and then your self worth will just plummet. Always try to go into projects of, why am I doing this? Does this align with who I am as a human? Like, for example, Charles, you have this podcast probably because you love to learn. So create situations and side projects. They don't have to be your full-time thing that align with who you are, that nobody can take away from you. Nobody can fire me from my newsletter except me? So basically try to diversify the things that you do and never attach your identity to something that somebody else controls.
Great advice, because I see that a lot, and James Clear mentions this as well, is that you can take the qualities from a role that you were in. Maybe you were in the military or a leader, and you can use those same qualities in a different role, but your identity should be your own name and your own unique, authentic individual space, not something that you've assigned or society has assigned to you. Well, thank you so much, Paulina, for having this interview today. Remind our listeners how they can get in touch with you and learn more about your work.
You can find my newsletter, The Profile, at readtheprofile.com, and you can find the book Hidden Genius at hiddengeniusbook.com.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.